Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. Hi, Sydney. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So today we are going to talk about your story of having a little one in the NICU.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And so, there's a lot to your story, but why don't you tell me kind of coming up to the labor and delivery, what was pregnancy like for you? How were you feeling kind of leading up to things?
For sure. I was pretty, I had, for the most part, a very non-eventful pregnancy in the beginning. I'm also someone who likes to research and prepare and all that sort of thing. So I felt really on top of my information. I also, since I was a kid, wanted to be a mom, wanted to have kids. So I was really excited. So I felt very prepared, and I also felt very prepared that I couldn't be prepared for everything. So, still laugh at myself in hindsight, but felt pretty proud of myself that I was like, I know anything can happen. Like, I'm ready for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So towards the end of the pregnancy, they started to see that my amniotic fluid was low. So I was being monitored quite regularly. And I was fine. I had a midwife. I wanted a, birth without drugs, vaginal, all this sort of stuff. But I had really accepted when that stuff sort of started to happen. He was also sitting breech. So because of the breech position and the low fluid, they were pretty sure he wasn't going to turn. So then I ended up in shared care with an OB and my midwife. And I found that process really stressful leading up to the birth, kind of having so many people involved in the care, and also feeling like I was seeing different OBs every time I was going to the hospital and this sort of thing. And
Right.
I was always sort of getting asked by people, why are you here? What's the situation? And feeling like, wait, shouldn't you be telling me that? Like, I'm not totally sure. This is just what I've been told. But even still, I felt really well. And I didn't have, I didn't really have concerns. I then accepted the C-section, all this sort of stuff. And then at 36 weeks, when I went in for one of the regular sort of checking, that the non-stress test and that sort of stuff, they checked me out again. And it was a similar thing where it didn't seem like anybody sort of knew why I was there or what was going on. And then they said, okay, yes, well, we want to take you up for one more test today. Okay. And then got sent home. And then after I went home, then got a call back saying, oh, actually, the doctor wanted to talk to you. Can you come back? I said, okay, sure, come back. Okay. And then when I went back, I walked right into a room of like 5 people, I think 4 or 5 people in a very small room. So it felt quite overwhelming. And all they said was, hi, we're the high risk team. When did you last eat? And, given my extensive research, I said, so I'm having the baby today, because that to me was the question about like how many hours they have to wait before they could do a C-section. So yes, so non-eventful most of the time, a little bit stressful in the last few weeks. And then at 36 weeks, kind of everything started going a bit haywire. And my son's name is Sebastian, and Sebastian came at 36 weeks in one day. So yeah.
Wow. And so in that moment when you walked into that room and there was lots of staff and kind of when did you last eat, and we're the high risk team, do you remember what that felt like for you, that experience?
You know what? Honestly, at that time, I was excited.
Right.
I think because to me, the high risk situation was still just that if he wasn't able to kind of grow and move and the fluid had gone too low, that he would just have to come. So I didn't feel worried in that there was never any indication that his health was at risk, nor mine. It was more just that he needed to be on the outside versus the inside to be safe and to keep growing. And so I was just more excited that I was going to get to meet him early. So I was like, oh, it's just kind of the adrenaline's going. So yeah, I didn't feel scared and I didn't feel worried. And while I did feel really kind of uncertain about different reasons in terms of the communication that I was getting, I didn't feel I felt well taken care of, in that I was in a hospital that has great reputation. Like, everyone who did treat me, like, I trusted. So I didn't feel worried on that front. And I really honestly, and I don't know why or how, looking back on it, but I really just didn't see the NICU as a possibility. Like, I hadn't engaged with that idea. And that's why I say I laugh at myself, being so prepared in this sort of thing. And everyone says you can never prepare for parenthood, and they're absolutely correct. But when you're pregnant with your first, I think everyone thinks they're prepared.
Yeah.
you just don't know what you don't know. Yep. But I really don't know why. I don't know if it was this idea that I felt I had done everything right in pregnancy. I had done all the healthy things and the preparation and this, but it just, and maybe also a protective mechanism, at the time that I was pregnant and gave birth, I worked for Sick Kids Foundation. And so I was in a world being exposed to, very sick children and babies all the time. And I think that I felt both in comparison, what I was going through was very minimal compared to, the people that I, had the absolute honor to work with and be around all the time. The things that they go through are just incredible. And so I just didn't think about it. I thought, there's nothing about my situation, and they flagged nothing about my baby that would send us there. So It just wasn't a thought. So I just did not prepare for that at all.
Right. And even if it was a thought, like knowing yourself, if you had that thought, you probably would have researched a lot, right?
Yeah.
And kind of working in that field and kind of understanding, how sometimes babies do go to the NICU and seeing those kinds of stories and things. Do you think you would have felt, quote unquote, more prepared, knowing what it was?
Right. I don't think so. I think, I talk about it as prepared in the sort of informational sense, but I think really what I mean is in the emotional sense. Right. Even when I was in the NICU, one of my sort of protective mechanisms, I suppose, was I really didn't want to engage. And this is the irony, and I'm sure we'll kind of get into this later, but I really didn't want to engage with the other families there. I very much didn't want to associate with this idea that, like, I'm a NICU family. It was like, no, we're just here for like a very short amount of time and then we're leaving. Like, I just need to get through the days to get out of here. Like, this isn't a community to me. Like, I didn't want that at that point. I wanted to be out. I think there is an informational aspect in that I didn't know what to expect. And so, I'm a planner, all this kind of thing. Like, I didn't know the social norms. Like, is it normal to leave your baby overnight? Or like, is everybody judging me if I do that? Am I a bad mom to like leave to sleep or do this or whatever? And so I felt a lot of stress and anxiety around that. But yeah, I think so those little pieces, I think that would have helped informationally to be prepared in that way, and just like, this is what it looks like. This is the reality that, the nurses, and these are the things that I know that nurses change shifts and this sort of thing. But even just to say from someone about your specific experience, like, okay, you're going to have a different, and this is how the transition works, that sort of thing. Yeah. But again, to actually prepare for that, the amount of people who really end up in the NICU, you don't want to prepare all the people who don't end up. You don't want to add that stress and that work and whatever. So it's kind of like, can you ever emotionally prepare if you don't know someone who's been through it before and prepare in that way?
Yeah, I agree. It is a tough one, because when people are pregnant, also a lot of times, like, people around us, like, they want to stay positive and happy and let's not think about bad things. And but then also even thinking about, well, what can postpartum look like? Talking about mental health issues or having babies with medical complications or being in It's, or having an emergency C-section, like even sometimes like we don't even want to think of that possibility when we're
Yeah,
pregnant,
for
and
sure.
it is that fine line between like stressing yourself out, worrying about what if something bad happens, to also like, okay, I just have it on my radar that it's
Hmm.
a potential.
Hmm. Yeah. I think these sorts of conversations are really important too, because I remember being pregnant, and I don't know if it was a function of my workplace, but I don't think so, because I remember it happening in my personal life too. But anybody who did have anything challenging kind of at their birth, end of pregnancy, that sort of thing, they really wanted to tell me about it. And I
Mm.
remember really not liking that. Right. I remember even talking to my midwife about it, kind of being like, people are just like unloading. Essentially, I didn't think it in these terms at the time, but they're just unloading their trauma onto me.
Yeah.
But what that really is telling me in hindsight is that we don't have enough avenues for people to share their stories, so that they aren't so charged years later that when they see a pregnant person, they just have to tell them these awful things that happened to them, right? Because
Right.
I wouldn't have been opposed to hearing people's realities and hearing the story. I mean, to a degree, you don't want to hear all of the terrible things that could happen, because then it just puts it all in your head. But there is an element of like, we can share space as, birthing people and people with children, and I'm happy to kind of hear your story, and if I'm sure there's things I can learn from it as a pregnant person or whatever. But the way that it happened, there was a lot of emotional charge when people were telling it, right? And you can tell, hindsight, that they didn't have a chance to work through that. They didn't have anyone to really hear them and to validate what they went through. And so they were just finding every pregnant person to do it to.
Yeah,
And it's
absolutely.
not the
To
right audience.
process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly, right? That storytelling that, over
Yeah.
and over and over, trying to process like what actually happened.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I agree. And I think, that comes into why like we try to do this, right? To give space to people to share their story, and also for others to hear like these things
Hmm.
do happen, and
Hmm.
also like, oh wow, that's a similar experience to me, that connection there as well. And then to encourage people too to seek support, to seek someone
Absolutely.
go to try and process the story, and be able to, like you said, not being as charged, right? That's that trauma response,
Hmm.
that physical visceral reaction coming in and saying, okay, I need to get this out, I need to get this out, and I'm so worried for you because
Hmm.
this happened to me, and it feels so real and
Hmm.
so scary, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for
Absolutely.
sure. Yeah. And so, yeah, so that I found difficult. But again, yeah, just kind of, I think, again, that I don't know that it's a bad thing. I'm not sure how I think about it now, but again, every time I would hear things like that, I was like, oh, but I've prepared, so I that won't happen to me,
Right,
that would
right.
kind of be my thinking around that sort of thing.
Right.
Hmm.
And I'm curious to know, when you say like I didn't want to identify as, like being a
Hmm.
NICU graduate family, or, being in
Hmm.
this community, can you share what was the
Hmm.
concern if I do become part of this community, or I do kind of talk to other families and
Hmm.
become more involved in this community? What would happen?
Yeah. I think, so when Seb was born, the reason that he was in the NICU was just that his lungs weren't fully ready, weren't developed. So he needed to be on the CPAP machine. And I think the thing for me was, every day that I was there was a day I didn't want to be there, right? I was just, my absolute obsession and preoccupation was how to get out, was how to leave as quickly as possible, right? I found the environment just really threatening. So the hospital that I was at is an amazing hospital, and they had a brand new NICU. So every room, and they were a level 3, which just means that they dealt with some of the really, babies who were really quite sick. And so I didn't want to be likened to that, because I was like, my baby is not that sick. He's okay. Right. And I think part of it was that maybe I didn't want to hear the scarier stories. I
Mhm.
didn't want to know what was possible at that point.
Right.
And I think another part of it was that I was just so obsessed with this idea of like, any second we can get sent home, any second we can go. And so I'm not going to invest my time and energy into this. I'm not actually a part of this. I'm here as just a quick stopover, right? Like I'm not going to be here for weeks or months. We ended up being in the NICU for 3 weeks, but we were transferred to a different hospital about halfway through because he was doing generally well, but he was very small. Genetically, I have small children, so that frustration is that if he was born with his lungs fine, his size wouldn't have been an issue and we would have just come home. And that's what happened with my second son. He was born the same size, but we got to bring him home. So that for me was also a frustration. Kind of once you're in the system, it's like now I have to meet all of these rules to get out of the system. And you've dealt with the issue. The issue is now resolved. Like, get me out of here.
Right. Let me go home.
Yeah. So I think that was it. And really, I mean, my husband and I both were just really traumatized, and we didn't realize that that's what was happening in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there was a huge element of dissociation, right? Like I wasn't present in my own body and in what was happening around me. It was like, that was my way to just get through it. I couldn't engage really with the feelings, and to talk to other people about it would be to engage with it. And I just really didn't want to. I just wanted the days to pass until we got the check mark and could leave.
Absolutely. And let's just normalize, that coping mechanism of being able to dissociate. I like to kind of throw some gratitude at it. Like, thank goodness we have that ability, because that is how we get through trauma. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And if we didn't have that ability, it would be unbearable.
Yeah.
Right.
And I will say that when we moved to the other hospital, it was a lower level NICU. The experience was very different in that it was, so I don't know that I said this about the former one, but that the first hospital we were at, the rooms were all individual. You couldn't see anybody else. You could just see the nurses in the common hallway. Okay. So that was really isolating. And I absolutely understand the reasons for that, right? Like I said, other people were going through things far beyond what we were going through in terms of the health of their babies. And so you don't want to be on display. You don't want other people in your space. And I respect that. At the time, quite frankly, they weren't my concern. I was my concern, and I didn't like it. Yeah. But again, it was that piece of like, are other people leaving? Is everybody else here all the time? Like, what should I be doing? And so when we moved to the lower level NICU, that was where, kind of more the traditional, what you see in the movies and whatever, where everyone's in the same room, right? You have all the little incubators or little cots and you all can see each other. And I felt that for many reasons, including that because it was a lower level, most people were not facing literal life and death situations with their children. So the energy was also just much, much more calm. But just seeing people coming and going, seeing other babies, like, even if I wasn't actively talking with the other parents, like seeing them interact with their children, and then like I felt much more at ease. I was still really upset. I really didn't want to be there. And every new nurse who would come, I would cry to and say, I'd go home. Oh, yeah. But I wasn't, I felt very fearful at the first hospital. I felt like, and again, like, I know that they were doing their job. I absolutely know that. But again, in the moment, I'm my concern and my baby's my concern. Yeah. And I felt like they were always looking for something wrong with Sebastian. And so I was always feeling confused about, is there something else wrong that you're not telling me? Like, why are we still here if you say that he's doing well? And I'm sure that they did tell me straight out, but I don't remember that. That's not how it felt. And they flagged a couple of things that we ended up having to do a lot of follow-up genetic testing. My family celebrates Christmas Eve. We were at Mount Sinai doing genetic testing. And so it was just like, and Sebastian was born end of October. So these sorts of appointments really dragged out, where the anxiety of, is there something wrong with him, lingered a lot longer. And, of course, the outcome that everybody wants is there was nothing of concern, and he's totally healthy and fine, which we're so grateful for. But I mean, that was months of my life that I was really, really worried that there was some underlying health concern, something nefarious going on that I just didn't know. And so, I just felt like he was being really like put under the microscope, in my perspective at that time, really unnecessarily, right? Like causing a lot of unnecessary worry and concern, and, whether it's true or not, as the parent, you're just like, he's fine, just leave him alone, and that's obviously wishful thinking. If he wasn't fine, I would need and want to know. But yeah, so that was my hesitation to want to be part of that community, was that I didn't want to identify, because to identify potentially meant that I was facing something much more serious, and I didn't want to engage in that reality.
Absolutely, which makes so much sense. You were protecting yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, which makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know the impact on you, on your recovery. So, from all aspects, physical, emotional, psychological, what was the impacts of months of stress and anxiety around baby's health and well-being, being in the hospital, in the NICU, and then back and forth with testing and things like that for months? What was the impact on you and your recovery from pregnancy and delivery?
So I was so preoccupied with Sebastian and how he was doing that I honestly don't even remember a sense of recovery from the C-section. I know anecdotally and informationally, like I healed very quickly. Like the surgery was very seamless. Like the scar healed incredibly well. So I didn't have, from the C-section, kind of medical complications. And I was so, again, really out of touch with my body that I wasn't really even focusing on the pain or the physical recovery. But, it is hard on your body. Like I was sleeping on a little bench in a hospital room, like at 2 days postpartum after I, got discharged from the room that I had there. And it's hard enough to sleep in your bed after a C-section, and then to be traipsing up and down stairs and going in and out of the car. But even with that, I think I healed very quickly from the C-section. One thing though, physical wise, that did happen to me, but I'm sure my medical professional friends or anyone who's listening to this will maybe be rolling their eyes at me. I'm not sure, but around 6 days postpartum, my midwife came to do a follow-up when we were in the NICU. And it turns out that my blood pressure was very high. So I ended up getting actually readmitted, sent back up to triage. And that was a really difficult experience for me, because we haven't talked about this yet, and I think we might, but I really, really wanted to breastfeed. It was very important to me. And I was trying really hard. I wasn't able to fully feed at the breast because Sebastian had the CPAP machine, but I was pumping and doing all this. And I finally felt like I had gotten into an okay rhythm with the pumping. I was starting to get some milk, sort of thing. And then day 6, blood pressure's high. I get sent up to triage thinking, it won't take that long. And I don't know, it was a busy night or a quiet night, or I'm not sure, but I was up in triage for probably more than 8 hours. And my baby was 1 floor down, and I didn't understand why I couldn't wait downstairs with him and be called up when someone was available to see me. And then just the physical aspects took over, right? The room was cold. No one was around. I kept asking for a pump because I had finally just felt so proud that I had gotten this rhythm going. And then I had no access to a pump, even though I knew my pump was right downstairs, but I couldn't go get it. Anyway, the reason that I said, maybe people who work in the medical field will roll their eyes at me is because so they said I had postpartum preeclampsia. I ended up on medication for a few months for this. But quite frankly, I don't think that I did. I think that I was absolutely in a full-blown trauma response, and my body was just terrified and just in absolute fight or flight. And I just couldn't. Now, that's not to say that I didn't maybe need medication to help control my blood pressure, but I do think that potentially could have been avoided with mental health and social supports, and maybe didn't need to become a medical problem. But that was so then, add those medical appointments and follow-ups. So all the appointments for Seb, normal, or the typical ones that you have, plus all of the additional extra testing for this and this and this. Then you add, I have all these extra follow-ups for this situation. The first few months were just kind of a blur in no sleep and appointments and back and forth and this and that. So yeah, it's almost like my time was spent focused on all of the physical recovery, but at the same time, none of my headspace was there. It just happened.
Right. Yeah. Somehow you recovered.
Yeah. It just was part of what happened, but was not my concern.
Absolutely. And what about then even the psychological and emotional
Hmm.
healing from, wow, I just had a baby, kind of just processing. I don't know, for me, I was just like, wow,
Hmm.
I made a human and I grew a
Hmm.
human
Hmm.
and then I birthed that human and
Hmm.
wow, look at me, you know.
Hmm.
But like
Hmm.
having the time to process that,
Hmm.
you know, even if all is well, it's
Hmm.
still a big event in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did you feel that 3 months of really being in fight
Mm-hmm.
or flight and being focused on Sebastian and his care and
Mm-hmm.
all of those things? How did that impact just processing what you just went through?
Yeah, this is sort of one of the things that makes me most sad about the experience when I think about it, because I've had the opportunity to have another baby since Sebastian. And the experience that I had with his birth was very much all of the things that I had envisioned. And I'm grateful for that. That was very healing for me. But when I think back to the experience with Sebastian, I wish that I could have seen all those things, right? I wish that I could have seen what I went through and been proud of myself. But instead, I just felt guilt and a lot of shame. I felt like, why did this happen to me when I was doing everything right? And I also felt like the experience in the NICU really took away my ability to trust myself. It was that feeling of, for his first 3 weeks of life, I was not primarily responsible for him. I
Right,
could have left for that entire 3 weeks
right.
and he would have been alive and cared for,
Mhm.
not the same, of course,
Yeah.
but that's so disempowering, right? Like, that's this feeling of like, again, I know not true, but this feeling of like your baby doesn't doesn't need you, right? Like, you are not in charge. You have someone else telling you, now feed him this much, now do it this way. They were part of his first bath, all these sorts of things that you just don't get to do yourself. And
Right.
I think, whether I realized it or not, that also had a really lasting impact on more than our first 3 months at home. I would say our first 8 months, quite frankly, until I realized that I needed and went to therapy, because it had me instead. And I think everyone does this to a degree, but this just sort of obsessive Googling to find the right thing to do. There was no, because you trust the medical system, and I absolutely value it,
Mhm.
but I'm also somebody who also values alternate approaches to things.
Mhm.
And, I think there's nuance to everything, especially when it comes to people and humans and babies' relationships to their parents, specifically their birthing parent, right? Like, there is no one right way to hold and breastfeed your baby. There is not one, there's so much space there, but there isn't really space for that in the medical system, especially when there's risks involved. And I respect that, but I resent that. And I think, yeah, it really just took away my ability to be present and be like, this is the type of parent I want to be. I trust myself to do these sorts of things. There were so many situations and elements where, again, not on purpose, but I was essentially taught to not trust myself and my body. I think about my breastfeeding experience with Sebastian. I was so looking forward to that. And so already those first few days not being able to do it, really challenging for me, really upset about it. But then, like I said, my obsession became leaving. And leaving, I could get out faster if he was being formula fed. And I was trying. I was pumping. And after the experience with the postpartum pre absolutely sent me in a kind of a tailspin emotionally and mentally. And the next day, I then just wasn't really pumping much milk. And the production had started really going up and up. Now, again, in hindsight, and I know no one pregnant likes unsolicited advice, but I will give one piece, which is that if you can if you're interested in wanting to body breastfeed, learn about it before, because while it is natural, it doesn't always come easy. And lots of nuance to it. And so when I was pumping, I wasn't getting that much milk anymore. And so then, the team was kind of like, oh, well, it seems like you don't have much supply. And I said to the lactation consultant, and I will always, I will always remember this. And this is why I also try to be really careful, because I understand really the impact that words can have on people, especially in fragile states, vulnerable states. I said, is it possible that, the stress is preventing my milk from me pumping? Because I think I had read something about that somewhere, but I couldn't remember exactly. And she said to me, well, women in war zones breastfeed. And I think, and I believe that that was trying to be supportive, that what she was meaning was like, even under extreme stress, people can do this, right? But how I received it in that moment was, what you're going through is nothing. So that shouldn't be affecting your supply. So essentially, no, stress wouldn't affect your supply. People in stressful situations do this all the time.
Right.
So what that taught me was, don't trust my instinct, don't trust my body. I guess I don't have enough milk. Right. So then didn't that start a journey of medication for milk supply, supplementing with formula, bottles and this? And then, wasn't he spitting up at every feeding, because I was combination feeding. So I was nursing and then giving him a bottle. Well, all the things you learn after the fact, now I volunteer with breastfeeding buddies. I'm very involved in this sort of stuff now. It's like, okay, it's a reflex. They will chug a whole bottle, even if they're not hungry. Yeah. So here I am nursing him, thinking that I'm not actually giving him enough milk. Right. And then he's chugging a bottle more. Well, of course he's barfing it everywhere. Right. Yeah. And, I will say, I didn't do this necessarily with my medical providers, and that's maybe not the right way to go. But there was something that told me at 3 months, I was like, I have milk for this baby. I know that I do. And this is how I want to feed him. And I'm not going to time him. It's like, well, if he spends X number of minutes, that's too much because he's little, he's using too much energy. And look, there are truths to all of these things, but there is also a nuance. It's not X amount of minutes means Y situation, right? Like that's different for everybody. Anyway, so I just sort of thought, you know what? I'm just going to try this. And I knew that in, I think, 2 or 3 days, I had his next checkup for his weight and that sort of thing. So I knew that he was going to have eyes on him to know if this was not a good situation that I was doing. But I was like, I'm ditching the formula and I'm just going cold turkey, and I'm going to nurse him all day and night if that's what he wants, and just see. Right. And we never used formula again. And we breastfed for over 18 months.
Wow.
And what I learned too is all these little things, right? That your output from the pump is not necessarily the supply that you have, right? There are so many factors. It could be shape of the breast. You could have the wrong flange size. It could just be the stress that just makes your letdown not come because you're just preoccupied. So there are so many elements, but I was being shown all of these tangible measures and being told, you're not producing. This isn't enough. You have to do this. And what am I going to do? Starve my baby? I'm already so traumatized and scared that if they're telling me I should do this, that I'm not questioning that.
Right.
So I'm really proud of that decision, and I'm proud that I stuck it out. It was really meaningful to me and important to me.
Right.
It's unfortunate that it took that journey to go there. But yeah, all those things that just if you don't know, you don't know. And why would I question? Right. But I was very medicalized. And again, for reasons that I understand, but I resent it. And it has changed my relationship kind of with, well, I suppose, yeah. I mean, I am more, what's the word? I question decisions more. And I think partially in a good way, right? I have learned to advocate for myself better. Yeah. But I also find that I can be quite triggered when medical interventions are suggested. I get my back up very quickly. I'm like, I don't want that. And then I have to really weigh the pros and cons of, denying it versus going with it and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, I think, to go all the way back on that, just the words and the things that people say to you in those times can have a really big impact and can really change the course of how you do things. And so I really try in my personal life and in my volunteering and in the things that I do, to be that voice of validation. I never will ever suggest anybody go against what their doctors are suggesting they do, but I will tell people to really tune into themselves as well, because that's one of my saddest pieces of the NICU story, is just that idea that didn't trust myself, and I made a lot of decisions probably in the first year of his life based on what other people said I should do, or what the common rhetoric was that, this is what babies need or whatever, that went against my parenting values. And in hindsight, and in my opportunity to have another child and to see how I would do it, the peace and the joy that comes from parenting from your values and doing it without so much stress and intervention, which not everybody is able to do, has just been really joyful and really healing. And it restores my faith in myself to be like, yes, I did know those things and I could have done that, but I just didn't have the support that I needed to realize that at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I really think that a lot of people who've been in similar situations are going to resonate with what you spoke about, because we get into those, of course, those trauma responses. Like, let's validate that you were in a place where you were feeling traumatized, you were going through a really difficult time, and everything's heightened. And it's so true. Like, the amount of times that I've heard people say, I'll never forget what this professional said to me, in that moment, right? It's like, it stays with us forever. I can still remember, even from labor and delivery, again, just you're in a vulnerable place, right?
Yes.
I can still remember, some looks or, some like feelings that I got from professionals.
Yeah.
Like, oh, am I annoying them, or am I bothering them? And let's normalize that. Right. And the other piece is like, trauma takes us away from ourselves, right? You're in that fight or flight mode or freeze mode, and, trying to just cope with what's happening now. And so that takes us away from ourselves and our values, our parenting values. We're just trying to like survive. Right.
Yeah.
And that can be something that lasts for people where, that trust piece, it's hard to come back to, right? We can absolutely, but it's really hard. And especially, I think too, if we're really aware of it.
Yeah.
I don't trust myself. I want to trust myself. I want to parent from my values, but I can't access it. Like, that can be really frustrating and tough to deal with. How do you feel you were able to come back to trusting yourself, to saying like, no, this is what I feel is right for my baby, and I'm going to try it. And, like you said, if it's not going well, we're going to do something about it. Right. Like, this is the piece. I'm going off a bit here, but it's like, we can't prepare and say like, no bad things will ever happen. Right. I wish, but that's just not true. But can we come to a place where we trust ourselves to deal with what comes? For example, if baby's not, for whatever reason, not getting nutrition from, nursing, I'll reevaluate, I'll talk to the doctor, or I'll, supplement with formula, whatever, but it's trusting yourself to be able to figure that out. And sometimes we lose that. So how did you come back to that?
Part of it was time,
Yeah.
I think. But if I'm being honest, actually, every time I was able to come back to it was at some positive interaction or intervention from somebody else, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So when it came to the breastfeeding, my sister-in-law came to visit around that time, and just help from her, information from her, talking with her. And she's a trauma therapist, so I'm sure she was doing all sorts of stuff behind the scenes that I was not even cognizant of in that moment. So that was the one, her visit was the one that gave me that push to try that one. Then at 8 months, when I went to therapy, that's what helped me release the guilt and the shame, right? I was convinced, my background is in psychology, and I was convinced, and of course you only read, not in school, but after the fact, like preparing for baby, you only read the pieces you want to read, right?
Yep.
And so I had convinced myself of all of these wonderful benefits of the things that I wanted to do, right? The golden hour, the hour of just skin to skin after birth, all these sorts of things. their importance on attachment. So when I had a baby, and I believe these things, but I also believe now, and in the moment, this is the belief that I had lost, that even if you don't do those things, you can build that beautiful and positive relationship with your baby and your child. And instead, I had gone down such a spiral of the things that I had lost. So I didn't get golden hour. I didn't get to breastfeed in those early days. I barely got to hold him for the first few days, right? I mean, I had days when a nurse said, no, don't hold him today because, he's having trouble with this or that. Again, in hindsight, wish I had fought that.
Right.
It's like, I'm sorry that it will be more difficult for you because there are more wires, but do it anyway. And I didn't do those things. And so I worked myself up into so much guilt that we had lost this opportunity and this could not be regained. There was nothing to be done about it. That now my relationship with my son and he as a person are forever changed because we had this experience.
Yep.
And believing that story, I think, stopped me from trying to do certain things.
Right.
And when I went to therapy, again, you never forget, right? Certain things that sit with you. And I kind of said this thing, like, Sebastian being in the NICU, not being able to hold him, this 3 weeks being, separated from him in this way, we're never going to have, he's going to have these attachment wounds for the rest of his life. And she looked at me right straight in the face. It's kind of like, that is just, you're wrong, and that's what I needed to hear. That wasn't rude. Right. I needed to hear that. It was right. The beautiful thing about attachment is you can rebuild that, right? It's not a one and done. Now this is everybody forever. It's that you now have everyday opportunity to have that connection with him and to rebuild that attachment. And I don't know why I didn't know that or think about that, but you get so caught up in the guilt and the shame and the negative that I didn't see that light. And I just could only focus on what had been lost.
Yes.
And I think hearing someone really just say to me, no.
Yeah, you can do it.
You can do it. And also, look, I believe in certain things about, trauma and impact and what happens in infancy and how that can carry through the life. And so I do think that there probably will be lasting impacts. They might not come up in really
big ways,
easily accessible. Yeah. But I think there will always be something to Sebastian and to me and Sebastian that we are affected by that experience. We will carry that in our bodies and in our relationship in certain ways. I do believe that. But I also believe that we have a really beautiful relationship and one that is very securely attached, and founded on a lot of love and nurturing and respect. And I think that just hearing someone say those things to me, it was like I could release the guilt immediately. And it just changed everything, right? It was like, and there's an element of a trusted professional, right? Anyone on the street can say, no, don't worry about it. I'm like, well, you don't know the research on this, right? Right. Sitting across from someone who in your mind is legitimized in that way and having her tell me that is like, oh, it can be okay. Oh, okay. Right.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
good now. And then letting go of it is like the fog lifts and you see the reality.
Right.
And then I could see the reality of my relationship with him and how well he's doing and how well we're doing. It's like, oh yeah, okay, we are fine. I don't have to keep thinking about the 3 weeks. I can think about what's going on now in the last 8 months. And that's very different than the first 3 weeks.
Right.
So I needed that. I needed those external people to disrupt my thinking, right? I was in a pattern of really unhealthy thinking in that way. And it was affecting me and it was affecting us. And so I needed those moments and those people of disruption to stop those trains of thought and to just reroute me. And that's what helped me. That's what I needed. I don't know that I could have done that on my own. I'm not sure.
And that is, again, just validating that experience, right? Of getting into these, I don't love the word, but cognitive distortions, right?
Yeah.
Of the black and white thinking or the all or nothing thinking, right? Oh, those first 3 weeks were disrupted. They didn't look like what I wanted them to be. So all hope is lost. There's no chance for attachment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it feels so true. Right. But just because we think something or feel something does not make it true. Right. And so you're right. Someone else reflecting that and bringing us out of that can be a bit mind blowing. Oh, wow. Okay. And then it sounded like you came out of that cognitive distortion of that all
Yeah.
or nothing. And, oh, okay, wait a minute. And that is, how we change as parents and, how our brains change as parents is by doing. It's not simply because you birthed a baby or biology, right? It's the doing that, creates those changes in our brains and to become parents, right?
Yeah.
And look at, families that adopt and, families that maybe get baby a few weeks after delivery or even much later, and those bonds and those attachments can still happen. And also just normalizing how real that feels in the moment.
Yeah.
I can so relate to that when I was being assessed for postpartum anxiety and depression. And I was telling the psychiatrist, I'm bawling my eyes out and I'm like, anyone, literally a stranger could just come in this room and feed my baby and he would love them. He wouldn't need me. He wouldn't need me as his mom. Anyone can do it because I'm bottle feeding. I'm not nursing. So he doesn't need me. And the psychiatrist is kind of looking at me like, what? And it's true. It's so, and I was so adamant. I fully, truly believe that. And now looking back, we are so attached and, that attachment was there, from very early on. Even my therapist and social worker was able to see that in me at the time. And so it's true. I kind of struggle with knowing the research and the data around what are the impacts of trauma or perinatal mood and anxiety disorders on babies. And yes, there are impacts, and that's why we need to get people support. But when you're in it, it can feel like, oh God, see, I'm ruining my baby, I'm screwing them up, right?
Yeah. And the blaming that you do to yourself, because exactly that, you think, I am doing this to you, and but I can't help it, or it's been done, right? And that feeling of helplessness that you have caused this thing and you can't reverse it, and it's all your fault. And this is a full human that is going to go through their whole life and they're ruined because of you.
Yes. And I
mean, if that's not being a parent, I don't know what is. But,
exactly.
In this specific case, it's not true.
I know. It's so, oh my gosh. It feels like yesterday, feeling that feeling. And it's just so tough. And that was kind of what I was thinking about, what came to me when you were talking about that interaction with your therapist and kind of changing your perspective of no, wait, you can still, build a relationship. To me, the word hope came in, right? Oh, it sounds like you were able to get that hope back.
Yeah.
Because it's hard when we don't have that hope. That's a big struggle.
And when you build these expectations too, and then nothing meets those expectations, you instead are so focused on what didn't happen or what bad things did happen. And you don't see everything else around that. And I think the challenge too is, we encourage, people who have had babies to join groups and find their village and this sort of thing. And I absolutely believe that I think that's huge. But I also think in the early days, there's this element to when you're in those first groups, I think I joined my first group at 6 weeks or something. What's the thing everyone's talking about? Their birth, their immediate postpartum. So again, reliving it over and over, and not only reliving it, but and no disrespect, but people really are just concerned about their story, right? They want to tell theirs. They're not really they're listening to you, they're holding space, but not really. They're really in their own stuff, which is fair. But so I also just didn't feel like it was everyone else got to have these births that I would have wanted, right? And I'm sure there were elements that they don't share. It's oh, I actually didn't want that part. But what you're hearing in those moments is everyone else is getting to tell me about these births, and they're commiserating on these elements of it that I would give anything for. And I'm having to tell this super medicalized experience that I had that I'm not proud of, that I don't like, that I didn't enjoy. And then the NICU stuff and just that idea of nobody understands. And this is, the great irony of not wanting to be part of that NICU community while I was in it. And in hindsight, I think maybe I wish that I had found it afterwards. But by the time I think that I was in a place where I could have engaged in a productive way, both for me and others, it was almost like I was past the need for it.
Right.
I had found supports in other ways that weren't centered around that. But I don't know. I think maybe I would have found some value in it. And I don't know what that would have looked like because I didn't go through it. But, even thinking about when, we announced that Sebastian was born and this and that, it was like no one could say anything right. If somebody congratulated me, I was just outraged that they would think that this was worth a congratulations and they weren't acknowledging what we're going through, right? If someone would say something like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," whatever, it was like, "Well, how dare you? This is actually also joyous. My son is born," And it was like, and that immediate and just like visceral resentment towards everybody who hasn't done this before, who hasn't been through this. It was like, you cannot understand. Like, don't even dare to talk to me about having a child because you have no idea what this feels like. And I remember a girl I went to high school with reached out to me over social media. And she didn't even say much, honestly, but her son had been in the NICU when he was born. And I honestly, I don't even remember exactly the words, but it was just very simple. But it was, I know how hard it can be. It was a congratulations, but I know how hard it can be. I'm here if you need to talk. And we hadn't talked in, I think, over 10 years. And that message is probably one of the most, I don't even think I've told her that. Maybe I should. But that message was kind of one of the most meaningful because it was just like, there's someone else out there who understands. Yes. She can understand holding those two absolutely opposing feelings simultaneously of like, this is the worst thing and you need to acknowledge that for me. This is the worst thing that could happen to me. While also this is the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Yeah.
The birth of your child, your first child too.
Yeah.
But the experience being so not what you wanted. Yeah, I don't know how I got on that train. Sorry.
No, please. No, and again, I know that I have a lot of clients, who identify the same way. People listening, I'm sure, will also identify with that because it's this, and I think that's why people get so uncomfortable, like people who are on the outside who haven't had the experience because they don't know what to do or say because it's supposed to be joyous, but then there's this like heartache and pain or difficulty and it's awkward for everyone. And people want to just say, well, at least okay, it was hard, but at least your baby's here and healthy and fine. And who cares that you didn't have the experience you wanted?
That's the worst one, right? Especially like after you're home, you are so grateful to be home. You are so grateful that everybody is healthy, but like, and no one means it this way. And I know that, but the ultimate sort of dismissal of what you went through to get there, it's like, no, it's not at least he's healthy. It's like, there's so much more to it than that. There's so much that will be forever grieved, in this experience. And I'm grateful for where we are today and all that, but it never will change how hard that was. And it will never change, certain ways I see things or certain triggers that come up, even just when I was pregnant with my second son, every time I went to an OB appointment, the second I walked into that office, I burst into tears.
Right.
Just like, just being in an OB's office and like the potential of what could happen in that space is just triggering. It's just,
scary.
and that, and those are the sorts of things that when people say things like, oh, well, at least they're healthy, it's like, essentially they force you into a narrative where you have to be like, exactly. It's like, but that's not how I feel at all. That's really dismissive of what I've been through. But again, it's like, you're right. Really, no one could have said anything right. I will say there are much better responses and at least everyone's healthy. But really, I don't know, other than someone who had been through it.
Right.
I don't know what anybody could have said that would have made me be like, thank you. I was going to be mad no matter what someone said, I think. Right.
And you had every
but then it's also that awful tension in yourself of like, again, blaming yourself, feeling guilty. It's like, I'm not celebrating him and he deserves to be celebrated, but also like, that's not holding enough space for kind of my pain and trauma right now. Right. So there was no good option, really, I don't think.
And I think that that key word there, and again, I think this is uncomfortable for people when something outside of, everything's perfectly healthy and well, like with, the process is grief being present alongside welcoming a baby into the world. Right? That I think is really hard for people to reconcile when those two things exist at the same time. And like people don't want to acknowledge it. People don't like it's so sad. I don't want to be sad. I want to be happy because you had a baby. Yeah. And right. So even for, for people who are maybe have family members or friends who are having a similar experience or things don't go smoothly, take out the at least, or a but, take out the but, and
yeah,
and
absolutely.
Right? Like, I'm so happy for you. And it sounds like you had a really difficult experience, or even just asking the person instead of like, oh my God, you must be so happy that you have a baby. Like, actually, I'm traumatized and barely surviving. Ask the person, how are you doing? Instead of just assuming like you must be on cloud nine because you have a baby, ask the person, how are you doing? What do you need? And that grief piece, like you said, of kind of no matter what, when you look back on the experience, even if it's not a trauma response where you're like completely overtaken and overwhelmed, physically and emotionally, but looking back on that experience is always going to be that experience and never leaves us. I'm curious to know, what was Sebastian's first birthday like for you?
Yeah, interesting. So his first birthday, we had just moved out of Toronto. We moved to Kitchener. So we didn't know anyone here. So we didn't have a party. We don't have any family around really, but my mom flew in to be here for his birthday and it was just really simple. And yeah, I don't know that I remember being overly emotional about it. If I'm being really honest, I think that still at 1 year, I was still at the beginning of the work.
Right.
Emotionally,
Right.
I think that I still hadn't really delved into all of it. I was feeling better
Good.
in that I had gotten through some of those really acutely negative things. So I think I was almost kind of in the like still in the joyful period of coming out of that bad
Difficult.
time. Yeah, I
Yes.
don't know. I mean, my husband and I make a joke, when we were in the hospital and in the NICU, one of the only restaurants in the hospital was Swiss Chalet, and we would eat. And I just this visual of me wearing an adult diaper after, birth, because you still bleed after a C-section, still need a diaper. Just traumatized, awful, in a wheelchair, crying into a plate of rotisserie chicken and whatever, right? And so it's hilarious now. At the time, not funny at all. No, but we said that we should make Seb have Swiss Chalet for his birthday every year for the rest of his life. That's payback.
Swiss Chalet birthday party.
Don't come at me, Swiss Chalet. Your food's fine. But yeah, I think we were still more in that like we're happy we have a 1-year-old, but I wasn't really emotionally like. I know that the 1 year can be really reflective for people, and I just don't think I was there yet. I don't think I was in the safe enough place, like really truly deep within myself to reflect. I think that's come out since then at different occasions and different milestones, but the 1 year wasn't that I remember. Wasn't that just wasn't it. I don't know. Maybe I was just too preoccupied with the move and all sorts of stuff. Well, but
course, lots going on. Yeah, and that's the reason why I ask is a lot of people, and even not just the first birthday, but that birthday is like, okay, yay, we're celebrating. Again, the dynamic of holding these two things, like, yay, it's his birthday and, he's a year older and look at how he's grown and this is lovely. And this is the anniversary of my trauma or the trauma of like being in the NICU, that kind of thing can, again, sit and weigh heavy on people. Like you said, this was not the birth story that I wanted to share, or like, this is, there's resentment there for other
Mm-hmm.
people that, I don't get to share a story like theirs. And,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that can be tough, or it's just
Mm-hmm.
like a reminder of the beginning of a hard time,
Yeah. I think in the move, because everything was new, and honestly, if I'm being really honest, probably that was I mean, part of the reasons for leaving Toronto, more space, blah, 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 all the all the usual stuff.
Yeah.
But I think part of it too was like that was where a lot of um heaviness was
Yeah.
around that, right? That first year, given the trauma we went through, and just, my husband had started a new job the day we found out I was pregnant, and there was a lot of stress around that. He was commuting and, out of the house for almost 12 hours a day when I was on maternity leave with Sebastian. So it also wasn't a great year for our marriage and that sort. So I just think it was like we wanted a fresh start. So it almost felt more like hopeful than it felt reflective on that sort of thing. But honestly, there are two other days that are more of that for me. And one of them is the day that we brought him home from the hospital.
Yeah.
I think about that day more. And I also think about the day that we moved hospitals, because it was actually on Halloween and they transferred us by ambulance, right? And so that that was a whole other thing. Seeing your tiny little one literally strapped down in an incubator in an ambulance riding around downtown Toronto when everyone's out in costumes partying. That was a night. So I think I have a lot more kind of activation around those two dates, positive and negative. But yeah, I don't know. I reflect, I think, on different moments, him going to daycare for the first time, going to preschool, going to school. Those are the moments that I tend to, at least consciously, be more emotional about than necessarily his birthday. Actually, his birthday is Sunday, Sebastian's birthday. And and now it's just positive. It's just joyful. It's really, again, like I think the birth of my second and coming into my own I had that opportunity to do, which also changed the way that I can be a parent to Sebastian as well. I also always have that little bit of guilt that his first year was not what I wanted for either of us, and that the challenges that I faced impacted and will probably impact him in some ways. But he's just such a wonderful little person and I just, love our relationship. And I just think that when I talk about it, there's feelings there, certainly, and there's still resentments, and honestly they come out mostly in terms of my interaction with the medical system and those sorts of things, right or wrong. I don't consciously feel any of those negative things anymore. I'm sure they live within me somewhere and they come out in different ways, but in a conscious way, like not at all like that first year, right? Like there really is. And I want to recognize that everybody, that trauma and a trauma response is not directly linked to the actual event that you face, right? Like it's your response. But I do want to recognize that, like, in the scope of NICU experiences, ours actually was not very difficult and high risk. And so I do want to acknowledge that, like, it was very real and very traumatic for me. Absolutely. But I do also acknowledge that, like, it's maybe easier for me to have found this joy and this peace afterwards, because all of our outcomes and our experience ended up very positive and very healthy. So I just think that's important to say, right? Like, I know that everyone's experience is their experience, but I also know that I come from a place that my experience ended up with all good news stories,
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, and I understand that. And comparative suffering is not helpful, right?
Yeah,
Because there's always someone that's worse off than us or better off than us, right? And you're
for
right.
sure.
Like, everyone's experience and how we perceive and feel something as traumatic, there's a lot of factors that go into that. And it's not just the event, because we know, two people can go through the exact same event, but one can have a traumatic response, the other one not, right?
Yeah.
And so absolutely. And it doesn't have to be those typical, like, a car accident or being a war veteran, so many things can be experienced as trauma, right? And I totally understand too, that piece of, like, having good outcomes and baby being okay. And of course that contributes to feeling like, okay, whew, we made it through. And absolutely, so yeah, thank you for acknowledging that too, and sharing that. And so, Sydney, what do you feel could be helpful
Mm.
for, parents. I know you touched briefly on just like there was no mental health support, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, my blood pressure was through the roof.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it could have been the stress and anxiety that you were dealing with. What do you think would have been helpful
Mm-hmm.
in hindsight?
Yeah, I think that is really a big one for me, is that I felt that I was clearly not doing well when we were in the NICU. A lot of crying, a lot, like, but I don't feel like anybody noticed.
Mm.
We never got access to a social worker or a therapist. It was never suggested. I mean, it like comes on the sheets, they give you handouts and whatever, but like, it wasn't that I remember. It wasn't suggested by my midwife. I mean, look, my trauma response is fawn, like 100%. So, a medical professional, like in labor with my second son, I'm crying to my husband, oh, this hurts so much. A nurse walks in, I wipe my tears. I'm like, I'm doing well, thank you. It's like, I don't know why I do that, but I do, but that's what I do.
Yep.
But I think even with me doing those sorts of things, it was clear that I wasn't coping well. And quite frankly, even if I seemed to be coping well, I'm still a parent whose first child is in the NICU. So you should probably assume that I might need some support. And who knows what happens behind the scenes, right? Like, I don't know. And I also respect that, like, this is a system that is overworked, underfunded, all the things. I don't hold resentment to any individual person. I know they are all doing incredible work and like under extreme pressure. There's my fawn response. But but I felt very much like I slipped through the cracks and like no one was noticing me and nobody cared. And so to directly answer your question, what would have helped? Feeling seen more. Again, I don't know what training they have, but I do feel like there's just really a lack of trauma informed care in these spaces, these medical spaces that almost everyone is probably going to have some level of trauma, right? And have it manifest in some way or another. Again, I know that the groups that they do, and those are all ways to do that. But when you see someone who's unwilling to join those things, who's crying all the time in the room, like,
Right.
yeah, I understand that maybe I'm not proactively joining what's on offer, but maybe that means that you have to proactively come to me.
Right.
That would have helped me to have someone to have more mental health support from the beginning, right? I got all of the supports through the system, right? I got the call from the public health nurse. I got the visits from the midwife, and they all ask, how are you doing? Well, I'm doing great,
Yes. Yeah. Of
and no
course.
one to see that I'm not doing great, and I don't want to take away people's agency to say that don't believe people what they say after they give birth. But there is an element of like, many people have a similar response to me where you tell a medical professional what they want to hear, right? How are you doing? I'm doing great. There's no space for a different answer in my brain at that moment. And fear for what would happen if you do give a different answer, right? But yeah, I guess I just don't feel like anyone saw me as a person with feelings. They saw me as a medical entity that birthed a human that they're caring for. Right? As soon as he was in the NICU, he was the one being cared for. I was discharged from my room, and I'm now no longer their responsibility. And so I felt very forgotten and very unseen. And, my husband's in his own trauma response, and he's also, how we had kind of sorted out. It's like he's focused on the baby. And it's just that like kind of trite saying, but it's trite, but it's so true, which is like, who takes care of me? Right? Absolutely. Like, who mothers the mother? And we didn't have family in town. Like I said, like I have a wonderful relationship with my parents, but they just weren't there. And I was like, no, I don't want them to come. That felt very invasive at the time. Like, I'm in the hospital. My husband ended up, after a little while, just calling them and saying, you should just come now, regardless of what Sydney's saying. And that did help, and I'm grateful for that. But yeah, that would have helped. And I think, I don't know that it would have been joining the group or what form that would have taken, but having some sort of connection to someone who had been through it before, because that resentment of other people wanting to help or validate you or talk to you, but who hadn't been through it, my reaction was just, I was mad at them. Yeah. I didn't want their help because they couldn't possibly comfort or understand.
Right.
So having someone with that shared lived experience, I think would have really helped me. So both feeling seen by, these tens of medical professionals that I was seeing every day, any of them to kind of notice or care or to just really check in with me, really, that would have helped. And yeah, having someone who could really understand and relate, hold space, that would have helped as well. And all my friends and family and well-meaning people, I appreciate all that they did do or say, but it wouldn't have mattered. I don't think really. It's appreciated, but it just didn't, it wouldn't have been transformative. It was helpful, it was appreciated, but it wasn't
Right.
it wasn't really what I really, really needed.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, in that moment, it's not just, oh, we're dealing with a little issue here and someone's trying to be supportive and okay, I'll help, or it's okay, don't worry, it's gonna be okay. Right. This was a traumatic experience. Again, that feeling like we're so vulnerable in those moments, right? And we know that again, it's not just the situation that makes something traumatic, but that feeling of like not being seen or heard or feeling abandoned or feeling unsupported can lead to experiencing something as traumatic. And so again, it's not necessarily the severity of baby's condition or whatever happened to you during labor and delivery. Those things can contribute, right? So it's, I think too, you were able to get support, on your own that fit for you, like seeing a therapist. And I'm biased, of course, I think it's great, but it's not necessarily accessible to everyone or, things like that. But finding those supports, reaching out to someone, anyone that you think you'll connect to, I think can be so helpful, and just really trying to like just be connected to someone, to find some kind of support and relief to talk to, and then I think too, even kind of like months down the road when, maybe you're starting to sleep a little more, or for example, babies kind of come out of their medical situation where you're not going for as much checkups or testing and things like that. And things kind of start to settle. And then all of a sudden, like, whoa, that thing happened. That was a lot, that I see that too, right? We're like 6 months down the road or even a year down the road, and people all of a sudden are like, all their trauma responses are coming out, so just check in with yourself. I think being, aware of what, how you're feeling, and okay, I'm not doing great, I need some support.
And hearing these conversations and also understanding the ways, we won't get into this right now, but understanding how your trauma responses might be showing up, to recognize that that is what's happening. For me, it was an absolute anxious obsession with sleep. The timing, the tracking, it just absolutely changed my life, the way that I was obsessed with that. And in hindsight, I can see that for what it is now, right? But that's also so normalized in parenting circles right now. And it's seen as like, well, that's what you do to help your child sleep and this and that. And the anxiety around that obsessive tracking, and also that, my opinion, false belief that you can control how much they sleep at night by timing this and this and this. And so more conversations to recognize how are ways that this sort of trauma or these sorts of, experiences of postpartum anxiety show up in ways that may be normalized in our society, at least, to then say, oh, okay, yes, maybe other people are tracking, right or wrong, everyone, can do as they wish. But, oh, maybe the fact that I literally am about to have a meltdown if I'm 1 minute, truly, literally 1 minute past the time I thought he needed to go to sleep, and I'm now convinced this is going to ruin the next week of our lives. Maybe that's not healthy and productive, right? Maybe that's not that I'm just participating in this way of handling my child's sleep, but instead this is how this is coming out. And if I get support for some other stuff, I might not need to feel as in control of this, right? Because there are just a lot of things we can't control about babies. They are just people, and we just can't control everything about them. But our desire to do it and where that anxiety manifests is telling us something. So being able to tune into that is important. And I think these sorts of conversations and other people saying, oh, wait, I'm doing that. Is that because of this or that? Having that moment to check yourself and to like reflect on why that may be happening, I think is important, because there are so many dominant messages that are actually, I think, coming from a huge, giant collective trauma, anxiety response, and everyone is just living in them right now. And I think that if people got the support they needed, we might not be seeing so much of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And that is so important, and especially like coming from a parent perspective of like, that's how it came out for me. And
Mm-hmm.
we see that with sleep,
Mm-hmm.
with developmental milestones,
Mm-hmm.
and feeding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these things that we focus on, especially that first year, right? And especially every visit, like those are the things you ask, baby's weight, where are they on this chart? And don't get me started about the chart. And
Yeah, me neither.
yeah,
I have small kids. Don't get me started on the chart.
absolutely. Right. And so, yes, like that is such a great indicator. Again, like a lot of people I didn't recognize it in myself either.
Mm-hmm.
I was just like, what is wrong with me? Like, I'm just obsessed with nursing my kid and
Yeah.
the number, right, that he's getting and the
Mm-hmm.
exact amount of milliliters and et
Oh
cetera, et cetera,
yeah.
et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
and tracking everything. And so, yes, you mentioned it before, like the obsessive Googling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like having to research everything, feeling like you're not trusting yourself as a parent. So I have to research everything to get the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the tracking the sleep or tracking the feeding, but to a degree where it causes upset and it causes,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a manifestation of anxiety, but also like causes anxiety. And yes,
Yeah.
like you said, you weren't joking when you said,
No.
being 1 minute off of nap time. I've also seen that in clients where
Yeah.
that anxiety comes in and just takes over, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if you notice that in yourself, if you feel like that could be you, just take some time to reflect and then maybe just reach out to someone, whether it's a friend or someone professional, but just talk to someone about it because there could potentially be more there,
Yeah. Yeah.
Sydney, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really think that so many people are going to resonate with everything you talked about. And of course, our experiences are all different, but
Mm-hmm.
there's commonalities in there. And I think that people will get a lot out of this episode. And so I really appreciate you sharing.
My pleasure. I'm happy to. And, like we say, I do hope that people resonate with some of it and that it can help even just one person. But, doing these things is also healing for us, right? This is just another way to share that story and process it again in a different way. So I also appreciate the opportunity to do that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports or go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, podcast episodes, and ways to connect with us. Check out our new episode every other Monday.